Excellent. So hopefully we're online now for today's meeting of the London Assembly Housing Committee, which we are holding online. And you can see the chamber, but we're not today. We're all joining from home. I'd like to welcome our members, guests, and public watching on the webcast to the meeting. This is an informal meeting taking place on a virtual basis. But nevertheless, we are going to agree things informally. So we'll not take any formal decisions or formally agree notes of our previous informal meetings on the 18th of January or the formal meeting we held on the 24th of November. These were included in the published agenda, but instead we'll defer the decisions on approving those things to the next meeting of the committee. But I'll go through the whole agenda today, and members can make any inquiries or comments on the relevant items. And for transparency, we'll still declare any interests and be able to note items. I'll call Assembly members to speak by name during the question and answer session. And as we're online, can I ask everyone to check their electronic devices are switched to silent mode, and that when you're not speaking, you can switch your microphones to mute to avoid any interruptions. But do remember to unmute yourself before having it. And I guarantee at least one of us, including me, will probably forget at some point. Members of the public watching might like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and also use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting if you want to discuss any of the things that we talk about. So can I now start the formal bits of the meeting? And for item one, can I ask the clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence have been received for today's meeting. We are expecting Assembly Member Cooper, who should be with us very shortly.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The item two is our declarations of interest. So can I ask us to note the list of officers held by Assembly members and ask members present if they can declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests for any specific items we have on the agenda today?
Noted.
None. Thank you very much. Item three is the minutes. And as mentioned, we can't agree the past minutes, but does anyone have any comments on the minutes that are in the agenda papers? No. Thank you very much. Then item four is our summary list of actions. So can we note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings and the interesting additional correspondence received?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Then we have item five, action taken under delegated authority. So can we note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members to agree the response to the prisons strategy white paper?
Noted.
Great. Thank you very much. Then we've also got to note under item 6, 2 responses to committee outputs. We got a further response from the Mayor of London to the Affordable Housing Monitor and a response from the Minister for Housing to our letter on retrofitting London's housing stocks. So can we just note those, please?
Noted.
Thank you very much. Right, so on to today's main item for discussion, which is alternative methods for expanding social housing in London. Now, we rightly focus a lot of our attention in the committee on the building of new homes and the funding the Mayor gets from government to add more social and affordable housing to our stock that way. But today we've agreed as a committee to look at non-construction methods of creating new housing and adding to the overall net stock of social housing, which should be very, very interesting. And I'm very grateful to the panel for coming to talk to us about that. We especially want to hear whether the Mayor is using all of his other powers in the right way to fully make the most of these other methods. So without further ado, I want to welcome each of our guests and thank them for joining us today. We have on our panel John Hughes, who is the Group Development Director for Notting Hill Genesis. We have Chris Bailey, who is the Campaigns Manager for Action on Empty Homes. We have Councillor Dermot Ward, who is the Deputy Leader and Executive Member for Housing and Development from Islington Council. We have Ben Denton, who is the Chief Executive of Legal and General Affordable Homes. We have Peter Matthew, who is the Executive Director of Housing, Planning and Communities from the London Borough of Hounslow. And finally, we have Josie Parsons, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Local Space, which is a specialist housing association. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll just move on to our questions now. I'm going to start with quite a general question to each of you, and because we've got a lot of panel members, I'd ask you to very briefly start by summarising roughly what's going on in your area. We'll have follow-up questions from other members of the committee to follow. So I'm going to go around you in the order that I can see you on my screen, starting with Chris, who's the first one to come to after my own face. And the question is, so what are these alternative ways of creating new social housing rather than building it from scratch? And how effective do you think these non-construction methods could be in expanding the supply of social housing in London? So that question first to Chris Bailey from Empty Homes, Action on Empty Homes.
Okay. Well, obviously I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of whether there is additional stock that could be brought into use. And in terms of empty housing stock, London is striking in being the only region in the country where empty homes have risen every single year for the last 5. And it's also the only region where numbers rose even past the pandemic. Most regions experienced a slight drop after the pandemic when they surged ahead because the housing market was closed. So there is a certain amount of empty stock there, and it's reasonable to say that some of this could be moved on. And wiser heads than mine, including the Affordable Housing Commission, led by Lord Best, have suggested that one mechanism councils could use for moving some of this intractable stock back into the market and retrofitting it and turning it back into warm and sustainable homes would be to utilise their existing sort of economic mechanisms to purchase that property and use it as social housing. The powers for compulsory purchase and this sort of enforcement, which a lot of people will talk about, are weak. And at a mass level, that isn't really a viable way forward. I think it's reasonable to say. It might be something we could all campaign about, but it's not ultimately going to be a simple mechanism. If they want to do it, they're going to have to do it through leasing schemes, which a number of local authorities do already. Camden, just to mention but one, will offer grants to people in possession of homes that are not in use, and maybe people who can't bring them into use or don't have the financial or wherewithal to bring them into use. So you can use a combination of enforcement powers and incentives, and I think sticks and carrots are needed in this kind of area. That's one side of it. That's if you like your long-term empty homes. You're 30 or 40,000 of those kicking around, and probably another 20 or 30,000 covered by various forms of exemption category or shorter term vacancy which may move back into the market normally. The other area we get into talking about a bit is homes that are sort of sucked out of residential supply by other forms of utilisation. And this is where we can be. And that's something that's grown enormously in London. 5 years ago, there were about 15,000, 20,000 listings. There's now approaching 100,000 listings. And London councils have estimated that up to 70,000 homes are being sucked out of residential supply by that. And funnily enough, we've got a meeting on this with some European academics and campaigners this evening, and we're looking at comparative approaches to Airbnb regulation. The reality is that there is to a strong degree the mayor and borough's hands are tied. They probably could do more. Whenever Camden, who've launched a few investigations into this, have looked at it, they found that nearly everybody breaks the 90-day limit. And when you look at the average return on Airbnbs in London, which in the central boroughs is around the £150 to £160 a night return level, you can sort of see that moving those back into the long-term rental market wouldn't necessarily be enormously disadvantageous to the owners, but obviously it would be a different type of return. So again, here you could make a strong argument for regulation, if it were possible, being effective, and we've seen quite significant changes in places like Berlin, Amsterdam, Paris, and indeed Barcelona, although the Barcelona moves were probably motivated by a slightly different.
We'll have some more questions on all of this later on.
There you go. That's a long intro. That's enough from me, isn't it?
Thank you very much. No, that's really, and you've given us a sense of the scale of each of those different things, so we can ask you more about implementation options later on. So moving around my screen, the next person I have is Ben Denton from Legal and General. So please let us know what you think.
Thanks. So Legal and General's. So I'm Chief Executive of Legal and General Affordable Homes. Legal and General is a top 10 investment manager in the world, and I guess our business model is to invest society's hard-earned pension fund cash into activities that deliver fair returns to pension fund holders, but also deliver societal benefits. So the business that I sit in mainly builds new affordable homes. We'll build about just over 2,000 homes this year. We've only been going 4 years, and obviously it's to add to supply in the marketplace because our reflection is not enough is being built. We're also super interested in how can we increase the supply of affordable housing, not through building. I guess our reflections at the moment are, so what are the challenges in the marketplace? So there is the provision of long-term investment to be able to fund affordable housing, and our costs of capital are pretty similar to the affordable housing sector. So the funding costs are similar. I think the reflection is for housing to be converted from one tenure to another, there needs to be subsidy. And that subsidy is lacking. We have some forward-thinking local authorities that are going out and borrowing their own money, and Islington's a great example, and I know other local authorities are doing it, Hounslow as well. But ultimately, the borrowing that they bring forward has to be funded from somewhere, and obviously it may save revenue costs because it might be reducing your TA bill or something like that, but ultimately that's the issue. So one of the challenges is to say to what extent could subsidy be used on purchasing second-hand stock rather than purchasing new stock. I think it's worth remembering that most new stock is at the top decile of house prices in its local area. So the amount of subsidy, pound on pound that you'd need for new stock to subsidise new stock to make it rented is obviously in relative terms higher than subsidising second-hand stock. I did for a short time work for Westminster City Council, where with Councillor Devonish, so where we were constantly looking at acquiring stock, both in borough and out of borough, to be able to add to supply, to provide a range of housing for people to have more stable housing. So I think my reflection is that there is the lack of subsidy to be able to purchase homes is something that needs considering in terms of when there's a subsidy pot, how many homes can you deliver with that available subsidy pot? I think the second issue that we found particularly interesting, picking up Chris's point. So from a legal and general perspective, we do have a number of transactions with local authorities where we support them in long-term financing structures to deliver affordable housing. So Croydon's a good example where we entered into so Croydon purchased a number of homes. We then entered into a long-term funding transaction with them, and it reduced down their costs of funding. So effectively, that was a revenue-saving activity whilst adding to the affordable housing supply that they had. And we've got a couple of those discussions that are active with local authorities at the moment. What are the barriers that stop us doing more in that space? I think first of all, well, as we said, there's if there was a little bit of subsidy, that would help, and particularly if we can tie together greening homes, so purchasing homes and greening them, and that's something that we're really interested in because energy costs are a massive proportion of people's costs nowadays. So tying those two things together is really, really important. As an institution, we pay SDLT if there isn't grant in the home, whereas if there is grant in the home, there isn't SDLT paid on the home. So then if you can save SDLT, that means you can spend more money on retrofitting. Stamp duty, land tax. Sorry. So it's all to do with if you can save costs on the purchase cost, then obviously you can apply that investment into greening the home rather than that cost going to the Treasury. So it is an interesting space with a number of local authorities doing some really exciting things. But I think my reflection is if we should be experimenting with some more subsidy in this space to see what the outcome is relative to the diversion of subsidy compared to what would have otherwise been delivered in new build supply. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Okay, the next person I have on my screen is Dermot from Islington, who you've been mentioned in the previous contribution, so that's helpful. Do you want to tell us what you think about the general question of how applicable this is, particularly in your borough?
Thank you, Chair. There is so much that we can do in this space, and I think Islington's been making a very good stab at it. To date, we've bought 186 properties, and we're still actually in that process. We've bought these properties through a combination of right to buy receipts and borrowing, and a combination of grant from the mayor and borrowing. As I say, 186 to date. We're currently buying 4 homes a week, approximately. So 30. We're kind of in the middle of a programme where we're using the mayor's grant. 34 we've bought so far using the mayor's grant. It'll be 120 homes by the time we've got through that programme. We've currently got 870 households in temporary accommodation. Our aim is to have all of our households in temporary accommodation, both in-house, as in homes owned by the council, and in borough. 70% of our temporary accommodation is already in borough. Once we could get through this programme, it will be around 80%. But the ultimate aim is to have 100% of it in-house and in borough. So yeah, there is so much we can do in this space if we have the right tools. It's worth mentioning as well, there are 28 flats at Wellington Mews by Pentonville Prison in Islington, owned by the Ministry of Justice, and they are they've been empty for the best part of a decade. So in 2019, Islington Council came to an agreement with the Ministry of Justice that we'd take on the lease. We'd take on the lease for the buildings, and we would take care of the refurbishment costs, and we would use these as family-sized temporary accommodation as well. It was very, very unfortunate, very sad that the Ministry of Justice pulled out of that deal at the last minute. But our door is still open. If the Ministry of Justice want to get those 28 flats back into use, we can do it. I mean, I'll meet them this week.
Thank you very much. I used to cycle past those flats every day on my way to work, so I know which ones you've referred to. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Okay, so moving around for a general introduction, we next have Josie Parsons on my screen. Would you like to address the general question about how applicable this is? Tell us briefly about anything you're doing, and we can follow up later on more detail.
Thank you, Chair. So Local Space, as you said in your introduction, is a specialist housing association. I need to just explain what that means, actually. So Local Space specialises in the provision of intermediate housing, and we do it in partnership with local authorities. We're currently in partnership with 4 local authorities. In the last 4 years, we've acquired and refurbished and put into social housing use around about 920 homes across East and North East London. We refurbish them to a high standard, and they are targeted, they're 2 and 3 bed in the main, they're targeted at family housing specifically. And the people who come and live in our homes are people who otherwise would find it difficult to get high enough up the priority list to be offered a more secure form of tenancy. So our form of tenancy is an assured short hold tenancy, but it's not a short one. And so although technically what we provide is temporary accommodation, temporary doesn't always mean what you think it does. And our average tenure length is around 6 years. And the idea is that it provides the family who occupy one of our homes with a springboard and the ability to live their lives in a productive and positive way, and enable them to move on into other accommodations should that become available. The availability of move-on accommodation is a real issue, though. It's an issue in East London and in the London Borough of Newham, where we have the largest locus of properties. The Assembly will be, I'm sure, aware that their homeless register is the largest in the country. So it's a really big need. We tend to our client groups. They are families, and they are some of what you might regard as hidden homelessness. So they're not people who are sleeping rough on the streets by and large, although they might be sleeping in their car. That's more common than you'd realise. But they may be also sofa surfing or living in very overcrowded circumstances with family or something of that kind. And they broadly, we refer to that as being hidden homelessness. So homelessness figures that are calculated on that day in November when they go out and they have a look, that is the tip of the iceberg. And I think we all know that that's the case. The working in partnership piece is really important for us. Because that means that what we target and provide for our partners is what they most urgently need. So we do have very good and ongoing dialogue with our partners to be really clear about the need that they have, and we do our best to meet that need. We're doing some really interesting work on retrofit at the moment. There's a pilot that we're doing. Now, a lot of the properties that we acquire will be common archetypes of properties that exist across the whole of the capital. So there might be those maisonette properties, that were built in the 1960s. They may be low-rise flats as well. We're doing a pilot to retrofit properties in a couple of common archetypes to an EPC A or better energy rating. And the reason we're doing that, well, there are a number of reasons that we're doing that. We are doing that to see what that looks like in terms of cost as compared to our standard refurbishment cost. We on average spend around between £25,000 and £30,000 on every property that we improve, and this will be over and above that. So we're looking to see what that looks like in terms of cost. We're looking to see what that looks like in terms of the availability of technology to improve the energy efficiency of homes at reasonable cost. Obviously, we're doing this with small numbers at the moment, so there are no benefits of larger purchasing arrangements. But we're also doing it to have a look and see what it might mean for people living in those homes in terms of what it costs to run the home. Because as was mentioned earlier, energy cost is a really massive expense for everybody. But if you're on a really low income, then that's a really huge issue. And people have to make some very difficult choices sometimes as to whether they heat their home or feed their children. And, that it's to try and deal with that as best we can by looking at the fabric. It's also because we are looking at how we do this in properties where we're not the freeholder, where we own a leasehold interest in a property, so it's inside the individual property, but they are very common archetypes that exist across every borough in London. So if this works successfully and we can then share the outcome of that, it might be helpful for local authorities that may own some of these kinds of properties in terms of how they think and plan forward for their own retrofit programs, which we're all going to have to do. So yeah, that's what we have been doing. In terms of grant accessibility, that's a real barrier for us. So we have engaged with the GLA and been successful in obtaining some grant for a small number of properties. And the reason that we were able to get that was because we were reducing the rents to the London affordable rent level rather than in the intermediate rent level. Our rent levels usually are at around about the local housing allowance level. So they're still covered by benefits, but we were able to access some grant to help us to reduce the rent levels in a small number of our properties. The barrier in obtaining grant for us with pre-loved, I'm not going to say second-hand homes, pre-loved homes, and they are pre-loved and very much loved again now, is that the space standard that the Mayor requires as part of the GLA terms and conditions is often not met by some of those older properties. And that's an issue potentially that we might need to have a think about. The GLA, when they're awarding grant, they have some flexibility around that, but it's not infinite by any means. And that is definitely a potential barrier, certainly for us in the way that we do business. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm sure we'll have further questions later on. But moving through the introductions, first of all, my next person on my screen is John Hughes. So if you would like to let us know what your thoughts are on that. You're a bigger housing association, obviously, so you might have other.
We are indeed a bigger housing association. So yes, and we operate primarily in London, across all the London boroughs. We develop around 1,400 homes per year. Of that, around 1,000 homes are affordable, and around 400 homes are market facing, and that's important for us. So I would say that the biggest levers that the GLA have is still planning and grant, and you shouldn't, overlook how important they are. And the changes to the grant regime and our, inability or restriction of applying grant to our own schemes in the future, where we're just delivering affordable housing through a Section 106, will really constrain our overall delivery and our affordable housing delivery in particular. So that is a concern of us. But turning to, that's on the new build side. We also have a programme of purchasing market homes that are second-hand from the existing market, largely interwar, post-war, home for heroes type housing in the outer London boroughs. Largely 3-bed houses with a garden. So three or 4 years ago, we sort of looked and identified that we had an issue. So most of our properties are flatted developments, and when people's circumstances changed, our residents' circumstances changed, it was difficult for them to get family accommodation, and it is extremely difficult to provide houses with gardens through a new build development programme. So we thought, how can we meet this need and also meet the need of other people who can't get suitable housing through the standard local authority means. So we decided to run our own programme of street property purchase, which was without grant funding. And we've been doing that now for a number of years, and we probably have about 500 homes in management. Similar to Josie, the rents are intermediate, so they're set at the lower of LHA or 80% of the market, and they're not local authority nominate. There's no local authority nominations, so we can prioritise our own nominations from our existing residents, and it's not regulated either, so it's not subject to any rent settlement or rent constraints. So we wanted to be able to predict and model what an independent housing product would look like outside of the regulation regime. So it's been very successful. Our residents are happier than our other residents, which is good. So there's a higher level of satisfaction. There's a much lower level of complaints. There's much lower levels of arrears and voids. So overall, it performs better than our main housing portfolio. So typically, for a 3-bedroom second-hand house, we're paying around 375,000. We're spending 58,000 on works costs, and that's bringing it up to EPC C and getting a good high standard accommodation. So the total cost is around 462,000, and a new build property is probably around 550, 560. So it's about £100,000 below that cost. They are generally in areas of lower income than where we'd be building our new build developments. So, we're not going to get these properties in Islington or Westminster, as we've heard. They're definitely, outer London boroughs. And it is very sensitive to rent levels. and rent inflation assumptions. So if you want to get the rent levels down to London affordable rent levels, you're probably looking at an additional subsidy of around sort of 100,000. At the moment, we put our own subsidy from our commercial market activity, and that subsidy is around £10,000 per unit.
Thank you. That was really great, and lots of numbers there, which we may have some clarifications on later, but that was really interesting. Can I ask one very quick cut? You said 500 homes are in it. What proportion of your stock is that, just as a quick number?
Oh, we've got 33,000 social housing homes.
In total?
Yeah. So it's a fairly low percentage.
It's a fairly low, yeah, okay. That's useful to know.
We've been doing we started off doing 100, and then we ran at 200 homes per year, and now we've pulled it back to 100. So, it covers about a 4-year period. Okay,
that's really useful to know. Thank you. Okay, and then finally, I think, I'm just checking because all on my screen. I think the last person we have is Peter Matthew, who is the Executive Director of Housing Planning Communities from Hounslow. Having heard what you've heard from the others, what can you say about this possible means of getting new homes from your point of view?
I share all of the views. I suspect my starting point, Chair, is to say from the Council's point of view is what are we trying to do? And at the end of the day, our primary aim is we're trying to manage homelessness. And we are all struggling with increasing numbers of homelessness. So my second point is it's very difficult to think about non-construction means without also thinking of construction means, because there is a balance between the two, which is the most cost-effective route. So with that caveat, I suspect what we're doing here is what I like to term we are disrupting the local market. And it's something I think that it's essential that we do, because if I looked at Hounslow's local housing market some years ago, I think many local authorities were beholden to the local housing market for managing their housing needs. And in a sense, we were boxed into a corner where it was the only source of supply. And that led us to actually secure accommodation, which may not have been of the right standards of quality and not necessarily at the right rent levels, both for the clients and for the authority. So there is something about actually, is the market right? And I suspect my answer is clearly no. So all our activities has been geared towards disrupting the market. And then the question is, how can you disrupt the market? Well, the basic way to do that is actually to engineer your own supply. And we have, in fact, we are undertaking many routes to doing that. And one obvious route for us is if you can't build it yourself, go into a partnership with get someone else to build it, and you either lease it or you rent it. That's one thing we do quite a lot of. We do, and we have been engaged in property purchase schemes, buying in bulk, and we've bought some from John. But we buy from housing associations in bulk, especially when there was a glut on the market of shared ownership. We simply bought them, and we bought it straight into the social housing stock. And I think that's the other point to bear in mind. We're speaking of affordable homes. My lead member will strangle me if I use that term. Okay, there is social housing needs, and it's social homes at social rents. So we do buy in bulk, and we have been buying in bulk from housing associations, and I think that's something we'll continue to do. We also buy in the marketplace, and we have been doing that for some time. And I think we've probably bought about 400 units. And we've entered into agreement with the GLA to buy 500 more by the end of April next year. So purchasing stock is clearly a route to get in stock in bulk. And I underpin this, it's about the bulk, because if we are truly going to keep a lid on homelessness, local authorities need to get that scale of supply, otherwise we're treading water. And I think the other thing that we have done, and we have used it to our advantage, is we have our own in-house company. our own in-house housing development company. One, because actually they are a very good vehicle for both building and buying. And so they operate both as a developer, but as a landlord. But at least we are able to say we've got on our books an ethical landlord, a landlord that we know will be renting at LHA or below, as well as we can be assured that there will be quality of stock. I think the other routes, and I suspect the question for us now is, are there new routes that we're not currently pursuing? And I think the point raised by Ben is an interesting one, because I think money is always an issue. And we've been fortunate that we have had access to grants, and we could always have a conversation about the flexibility of the access to the grants and the use of the grants. And I think there are issues that could always be tidied up. But I think the real question for me, we can do all of these things, but the question is, can we do that at the scale that we really need to really arrest homelessness increases? My instinct is no. And so the question must be, what is the role of private capital in all of this? And I think there has to be a role for private capital, but I don't think I have seen the right recipe being put forward by the market that actually says we can deliver you affordable homes, social homes, in the right packages, at the right money packages, that we can say yes. Because I do believe that actually money is not in short supply. There is money. There is land supply that local authorities have. The market has the money. We haven't found the mechanism or the formula that unites us together. And I think work can be done to get the right design. And I think if I had to think of where next, because I think we are exploring every avenue at the moment, that would be the route I'll be heading for.
Thank you very much, everybody, for that summary. It's really helpful to get all your views up front. Now I'm going to hand over to the rest of the committee for most of the rest of the questions. And I think Assembly Member Boff is the first person who's going to.
Yes, first of all, thanks for the very comprehensive introductions, actually, because I think you've answered a lot of the questions that we have scheduled to be asked later on. I wouldn't mind knowing, and at the risk of this sounding like how long is a piece of string question, perhaps people could comment on how many homes could be brought into the social sector in London as a result of non-construction methods. Does anybody want to come in on that? Ben, Mr. Denton, sorry.
Thank you. I mean, my reflection is that the challenge is it's if each local authority, as we've said, was buying 2 or 250 homes a year, that makes a massive difference. There's always a challenge that you don't want to be buying too much, because then there's a risk that you push prices. But certainly that's and I think Peter will have a good view on this as well. But it's about having the team and their delivery approach within each local authority, and running this as a standard programme each year across a wide variety of areas. But the challenge is you don't want it to be too much, but you don't want it. You want it to be big enough to be delivering impact, but not too big that it moves markets. And I think when we've looked at this, so with specific local authorities buying in specific areas, we've been really conscious to not be buying more than 10% of the homes that we're turning over within a locality, because that's a risk at which if you're having to buy more than 1 in 10 homes that sell in an area, as an example, there is a risk that you start to move prices, which obviously you want to try really hard not to do, because we're all talking about using public subsidy here in the most cost-effective way.
It's a very good reply, and you've kind of touched on my next question, is what the impact is going to be on the housing market of bringing a substantial number of homes perhaps into the social sector. And I note that we had a contribution from Hounslow saying their intention is to disrupt the market. I mean, how can you positively disrupt the market with rather than negatively? As you've alluded to, Mr. Denton, it can have a negative impact on the market if that was done in an ad hoc way. Actually, perhaps we could go to Mr. Matthew to ask that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is always going to be what's the point of no return, and where do you get to the point where you're actually disrupting the market in terms of land values. I don't think local authority buying at a scale that's anywhere near that. I think the investment requirement for that, I think, is beyond what is currently available. I think the disruption of the market is a genuine need to disrupt the market, not to affect prices, but to affect the quality of the private rented sector stock. Okay, I think my problem is actually that we are paying a lot of money in rents for tenants for properties which often are very, very poor standards. And unless the market itself realizes it needs to improve the quality of the stock, then you've got to disrupt that process. And the only way we can disrupt that process is by not relying on poor quality private sector stock. And the only way we can not rely on that stock is to have our own. So I think the disruption is more around actually getting a good quality product at a good price for house or people in need. But in terms of actually affecting the price elasticity, I don't think we can actually purchase at that scale. We don't have that investment power.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to my next major question, which is about social landlord purchase and repair. Perhaps this could go to Josie Parsons first. We're aware that you've got these purchase repair programs, and you've covered that very well in your introduction. How viable are these programs compared with building new homes?
We don't build new, so I don't have a direct comparison in terms of our lived experience, but I think some other providers have indicated the sort of differences in cost. We're in comparison with my colleague who talked about buying in outer London boroughs, we're buying in inner London boroughs, and our purchasing boundaries are lower and we spend less money, so we're aiming at the lower end of the market, and we can affect a really positive improvement in the quality of the home by investing in it in the way that we do, so that when our tenants move into their home, it feels like a new house. It's been nicely decorated, it's had a new heating system, it's had a new kitchen, a new bathroom if that's needed. All of those things are quite normal and what we expect very often in the properties that we buy. Quite a lot of the vendors are people who are moving out of the buy-to-let kind of market, and some of those properties, I can tell you, are in a really terrible state when we get them. But that, as long as there aren't significant structural issues with a property, that doesn't put us off. It's still worth doing. We would then modify the offer in terms of the price that we'd be prepared to pay. So I think it depends on where you're operating and what your model looks like. But our model operates both with and without grant funding. We have had grant funding in the past in different forms, and we also have a programme with the London Borough of Waltham Forest, which has, at the moment at least, a proportion of right to buy funding being added to it. Of course, the rules around right to buy funding are changing from April, and that means that availability will diminish quite significantly for us in terms of grant support by that means. But at the moment, we've been able to access 30% grant rates to assist us from the London Borough of Waltham Forest, which is great, because what it means is that our own investment goes a lot further then. For every additional pound of grant that we get added to our pot, it means that we're able to do more. And so that's really positive. From that point of view. It also means that we can look at properties in slightly more expensive areas. There are some areas, though, in East London and North East London that are totally inaccessible to us because the costs are so high for properties. Without wishing to name names, but I will do. Hackney is one of those areas where we're actually disposing of properties in that area because the values are so high that we can re-provide. We're doing a re-provision programme for the London Borough of Hackney on a 3-for-2 basis currently. So the property values in Hackney are so high that we can't provide properties in the London Borough of Hackney really at all, but we can provide properties in boroughs immediately surrounding. We're not providing properties outside of the M25 though. We're not doing anything outside of London. It's all London based, what we do.
Mr. Hughes, how viable are these programmes, and what are the additional costs of providing? You've covered actually quite well. You said about 58,000 to adapt, and Just Space said about 33,000 to adapt. How viable are they? Bearing in mind there's that sum of money, wouldn't it be easy just to build new homes?
Okay, I'll come on to that in a moment. I'd just like to go back to market disruption, first of all.
Of course.
So we're already seeing significant market disruption. So little or none of which have beneficial impact on the housing delivery or housing supply. So we had SDLT holiday, which didn't contribute anything to additional supply and just pushed up prices. We've had Help to Buy, which again has had little or no impact on additional supply. We've overseas investment, which again is inflationary pressures. And also we've got Airbnb with no regulation at all. Again, inflationary pressures on existing property. So I think we've got negative disruption going on. If we could get positive disruption from the local authorities, then I think that's got to be welcomed. So just turning to street property programme. So I said our average purchase price was 375,000. Then we're putting 58,000 into refurbish it, and all our own costs, so our legal costs, our interest, management, or the consultants. That's coming out at 462,000. So this on this typical model. So that's 120% of the value. So we're adding another 20% cost on top of the value. So in terms, is it producing good value? You could say no, it isn't. But is it producing another affordable home? Yes, it is. And is it producing an affordable home that in terms of its return, are we satisfied with? Obviously, we're putting in our own internal subsidy. We're getting a 2.9% yield. Our cost of borrowing is just over 3%. So it's constantly running slightly at a loss. But that's the investment we're prepared to make. But we need to make a profit from our private development sales in order to subsidise that. So we're dependent on that cross subsidy from the commercial activity.
So in summary, it's not great value for money, but it is at least delivering a new home. Am I right in saying that?
That's exactly it. That's the position that we take. We think it's not great value for money, but we're willing to do it because it's the only way we can secure 3-bedroom houses with gardens.
Thank you very much for that. I believe Assembly Member Moema wanted to come in.
I did. Thank you, Andrew. I had a question about when you purchase homes on the open market, there are the values that an estate agent will tell you this is how much a 3-bedroom house will cost you. Then there's the valuations that those of you that develop or purchase will use, I think, bricks valuations, which are substantially lower, I think, from memory, than what an estate agent will tell you. This is just me wondering, what would be the impact of the sector as a whole using the actual proper values that RICS provides, as opposed to an estate agent saying you live in a fancy part of town that's whack an extra 20% on top of it for exactly the same property? It's just, perhaps a question for John and Peter, but also really interested to understand what that would mean for what more you could do with your money from everybody else.
Shall I go, John, and then I'll let you
go ahead, Peter.
The first thing I'll say is that I'll never pay an estate agent's valuation, because I suspect if I did that, I wouldn't be able to afford it. I wouldn't be able to put forward a business case that justifies the purchase. I think the way I look at this is really straightforward. I'm a cash purchaser, and a cash purchaser tends to have power in the marketplace. And so we will negotiate the right price. And I think that's the way we approach it. I think to rely on any valuation, I think, is a risk to us. We will do our mathematics in terms of what is affordable for us, and we will go into market to purchase properties at what we believe is an affordable price. I think the other thing that when we haven't touched on it here when it comes to purchasing, I think there's the purchasing costs, but then there's a question about what's the long-term management and maintenance costs, which does influence the nature and types of purchasing that we can enter into. I think buying in bulk reduces the overall management and maintenance costs. The difficulty with buying property purchase is where you buy in randomly and in a dispersed way, our maintenance costs are higher. So we've got to factor all of that in to what should be our starting purchase price in the first place. So we do take these schemes literally scheme by scheme and determine what is the best price to pay.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on
that? I could come in. So I think Peter's covered the bulk purchase position well, and I think you're referring to the RICS red book value,
yes.
where Peter would be typically negotiating a bulk purchase deal. He does have power to drive that price down, and being a public funded body, they will be required to be able to frank the price they're paying through an RICS valuation. So it will be at that value or lower, and that would typically be the case for Notting Hill Genesis as a housing association also. But when you're looking at individual street properties, the market is really the market. It's you or I selling our own asset, and we've got to get whatever we can get for that in the market. And there's so many of these properties on the market that price is effectively set. So there is much less room for negotiation, particularly because it's just a single dwelling. So if that person doesn't want to sell that price, you go down the street and buy another one. Or if I don't offer another, someone else comes through the door and offers a better price. So it is much more market controlled. There are many more participants in the market for individual properties.
Okay. Thank you. I've wondered that question for years, so I'm glad to have been able to ask it. Glad that didn't happen. I do have I have some questions on buying back former council housing. My first question is to Peter and Dermot. There are obviously others, if they have a view, we're really welcome to hear it. So I know that Hounslow has secured 38.7 million from the Right to Buy Back Fund, and you've already talked about the homes that you purchased, and Islington has secured 6.4 million for 80 homes. It'd be really helpful to understand the bidding process and how the council can arrange the purchase of ex-council homes through this particular programme, and what scope there is to to expand it and be, as you said, a disruptor in the longer term?
Oh dear. That's an interesting question, really, because it's always with a heavy heart that I actually agree to buy back council properties. It is always with a heavy heart. But I think, and I do then make a differentiation between buying back ex-council homes and buying off the market. So in terms of our activities where we buy back council homes, I will buy that straight into the HRA. Yeah, so I am not using grant funding for that purpose, because chances are the ex-council's homes we will buy back, they either on estates and so on and so forth. And if you take the point of view about managing the stock, you may as well manage it as part of the HRA. So where we are buying back ex-council homes, we do not use grant, we use the HRA. In terms of the 37 million grant, we are using our company to be the agents for the delivery of that buyback scheme. And by and large, they're going out to the marketplace to buy the properties. They have had to develop a business model that enables them to go into the market to buy back the schemes on the understanding that the rent levels will be at LHA levels or below. So we are pretty tight in what we're asking them to do. It's not really about making profit, but as a company, yes, they've got to make the reasonable surplus. But again, it comes back to this question that the purpose of doing this is to secure good quality homes for people at rent levels that they can afford. And in that case, as John said, they are literally buying from the marketplace rather than council buyback schemes.
So I think our position is slightly different from Hounslow's. I mean, we've lost 12,000 council homes in Islington since the introduction of right to buy. So the reality of the market is that ex-local authority homes are part and parcel of that market. In fact, they're a very substantial part of the market in Islington. We very much take the opportunity to buy ex-local authority homes on our estates wherever possible. It makes a lot of sense. We manage the estate anyway, so it makes a lot of sense to buy on the estates. As you said, Sam, we have secured grant funding for this, and even before we secured that grant funding, we were doing it ourselves through borrowing and through our right to buy receipts. Yet we could certainly expand this programme. And as I said at the beginning, our ultimate aim is to have all of our temporary accommodation council owned and in the borough itself. So there's definitely scope for expansion there. I mean, the other thing about it is that the reality of the markets is that ex-local authority homes are a little bit cheaper in Islington than say street properties. That's just the way the market is. So there's certainly scope for expansion. There's been a lot of talk about market disruption today. I think there's a more fundamental point here. The market is broken. Most families in Islington can't afford anything above social rent levels. And the more we accept, and people talk about, the effect of foreign investment and other things. London property, particularly Islington property, it's frankly become a global reserve currency. And the more that we can disrupt that market through things like the mayor's buyback schemes, the better. We'll relish it, and we'll keep on doing it as long as we can.
Yeah, and just on that, really quickly, Chair, just on that point about the housing market being a global reserve currency, I don't disagree with you. I just would really be interested in Chris Bailey's views from the perspective of homes across the borough, the capital, sorry.
Yeah, Dermot makes a good point. And that's one of the issues whenever we're asked to calculate, and we've done a couple of bits with Trust London on this, calculating the real level of empty or vacant property or property not in residential use, then it's obviously well in excess of 100,000, 120,000 homes across the capital. And some of that is buy to leave, some of it's buy to Airbnb, and some of it is just, if you're a Russian or Chinese businessman and you're a little bit nervous about falling out with the Chinese Communist Party or Vladimir Putin, then, you buy a few flats in London. And there are some shocking examples, and it's much easier to do it in new build. It's one of the reasons that we have this narrative about building the wrong housing, because there are certain types of development which lend themselves to that. And obviously, when you market it off plan to a housing conference in Malaysia or China, and you want to sell at least 20% of it to get development going, because that will keep your funders happy, then you are kissing goodbye to a chunk of stock. And everybody's giving that plan permission and going, oh yes, contribution to residential stock. It's like, no, well, it isn't. But so there is a element of a kind of false market there, where we're building stuff and claiming it's residential and it isn't really. And and we are critical of that. And so Dermot's point is well made.
Thank you. I'll hand back over to you, Chair. Sorry.
Apologies. I just wanted to come in and get clarification from something that Peter had said, because it seemed to me like you weren't using the Mayor's right to buy back fund to buy ex-council homes, and I sort of understood that was one of the conditions. So I just wondered if that isn't a condition, it's just kind of a badge for it. Can you clarify?
So I think we are buying council homes, but not necessarily. So we've always bought back council homes, ex-council homes. That's a programme we've always had. I think, and this is probably something we'll get back to, what are the strings attached to these grants? I think when it comes to the Mayor's scheme, we're delivering it through our company. And so the company has scope to just go in the marketplace and purchase properties. There is no requirement in the Mayor's scheme that says it must all be council buybacks. So I have the choice. That's my interpretation of that.
So, Assembly Member Mohammed, if you'd like to carry on.
Yeah, I think so my questions have been primarily covered. Just a very quick one, I suppose, to Peter and Dermot. If, in addition to what you've said, the value for money options compared with new build of this kind of approach to reinstating social housing, I suppose, or acquiring it.
So apologies. So the big basic difference is that when you're building new build, this is pretty much what all local authorities do when they build new council homes, is that they build a small amount of private to cross-subsidise the council homes that they're building, and that's how you make the figures stack up. It's really unfortunate that we have to do that, but the reality of government funding for council housing is that you just have to do that cross-subsidy. Obviously, when you're buying a home rather than building it, you're not building anything, so you haven't got any private homes to use to cross-subsidise, and that's the fundamental difference in value for money. It requires more borrowing than building a new build home would. That's not something that we're going to solve here today, but I think it does require the government to look again at how they fund council housing.
And I echo that. I think the additional point I'd make, and yes, by all means we can get subsidy, but you still have to find the principal sum. And so the question for us is, if I have to find the principal sum, what is the best spend of that money? Now, I can say I'll go and buy an old 1930s house somewhere, and I will spend a lot of money to actually do it up, and then I'll spend a lot of money maintaining it over its lifetime. Or there are other objectives that we're trying to deliver through housing, and such as we also want to tackle the overall carbon deficit of houses. And so building, our aim is actually, our council house building programme is to build zero carbon homes. So if you then start adding in the additional benefits that you can acquire from building new, you will tend to actually, the scales of justice, if you want, will say go for new rather than build it buying old.
Okay. Thank you very much. That makes sense. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So we have further questions scheduled from Assembly Member Cooper, who I imagine also has some supplementaries. Would you like to kick off with what you want to ask?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I'd like to ask everybody really, and I don't know who wants to sort of jump in first. What's your view on the potential extent and impact of the source of this source of additional social housing? One of the issues for me, and I represent Merton and Wandsworth, and obviously Wandsworth was found to have committed gerrymandering along with Westminster. And every year has to do a declaration at the Housing Committee that priority group sales areas, which is what they called it during the 1980s. There was never a Shirley Porter figure in Wandsworth. So we've got absolutely thousands and thousands of leasehold properties which can potentially be bought back and they're on estates. And we lost a lot of the ones with gardens, and in Roehampton, so they're occupied by students who let all the gardens overgrow. You know, and then we've got children in upper floor flats and things like that. But what we really lost, of course, was the freehold properties, which all got sold off as well. And they're not even really on the balance sheet. So I guess my concern is that really, you know, that there is a limit to the potential extent and impact of this source of properties, that it's limited only to leasehold properties. Would you agree with me, or have you got experience of buying back freehold properties? And obviously somewhere like Wandsworth, you know, we're talking pretty high prices for properties that were probably sold off as huge discounts in all these targeted areas back in the day.
So in Islington, we don't have that issue because we're mostly buying back ex-council estate properties where the London Borough of Islington is the freeholder, so it's not much of an issue for us.
Right. So, no, we'd had a programme in Wandsworth in the 1970s of acquiring street properties. And then because of the bombing, when you had bombing runs coming in towards Battersea Power Station, that then created both a lot of big council estates where there are flats to buy back, but there'd been a lot of damaged properties. So we'd had a lot of housing action areas where certain housing associations had come in, but also the council had come in and bought individual street properties. So is that something that other members of the panel had any experience of trying to get back properties that were previously owned freehold by local authorities and were sold on a freehold basis to what had been tenants? No. Okay, so maybe that's just a Wandsworth thing because we've sold off so much.
Sorry, I think Peter Matthew has put his hand up. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I can just.
Yes.
Oh, you mean the little golden hand?
Golden hand. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Yes, I didn't see it. Peter. Yeah. Oh, but you're on mute though. I haven't said that for at least a day.
Sorry. I think the point you're making, I understand, and I would see that as a risk in certain localities. And I think the risk is a wider risk. This is really a risk around, are we creating single tenure areas and to what extent we're promoting mix and balance communities and so on. So if you look in Hounslow, if I were to say our property buyback scheme, clearly it is more beneficial to try to buy properties in Feltham than it is in Chiswick. Because the land value differentiation. So the implication of that is that the properties we will buy will be in Feltham. Yeah, and you could then translate that to say that the tenants we would locate in those properties, who tend to be lower socioeconomic groups, will be concentrating them in the low value areas. I think that's a risk, and I think that's just a risk that we all have to think, how do we manage that best?
I mean, interestingly, you've actually brought me on to my next point, which was that I actually thought the mixed tenure on estates of having some leaseholders mixed in with tenants and then reflecting that into the street properties where you have private rented, social rented, and then obviously private ownership, and having that sort of social mix, that there are benefits to that. So I wondered, and obviously Peter's touched on this, do other people think that there's a sort of, having sort of mono tenure is an issue? Because obviously in the past we have had whole estates of council properties where it's all just tenants. Probably down streets, it's always been a mix between private rented and private ownership. But would you agree that having that sort of mix of tenancy is, or mix of ownership, is a good thing?
Yeah.
I think that's a yes from Peter. And is that Ben who wants to come in?
Yeah. Can I have a quick go at this. So I guess if we step back and look at the numbers, so there's 3.6 million homes in London. Roughly speaking, about 10% of those homes get sold each year. Even if each local authority in London purchased 200 homes a year, being 6,000 homes a year, which would make a meaningful impact on affordable housing delivery. I'm not sure what the last year's numbers are for affordable housing completions, but that's less than 1.6% of all sales in London. So when you step back, it's whilst it is it does feel to me that at modest levels of purchase, the impact can be significant in terms of taking 6,000 homes off the housing, particularly out of TA each year, without necessarily, whilst at the same time creating, attractive and mixed and balanced communities where all ranges of households can continue to live alongside their support networks of their friends and families. So.
Thank you. And I can see that John has put his hand up as well. Now it's very dark in the corner of my screen. I'm not quite sure why. John.
Yes. So if you go back to pre-Right to Buy and the makeup of local authority estates, you would have seen quite a widespread of income levels and occupations, and so you had a mono tenure, but actually you had quite a diverse community. And I think we are a bit lazy. We talk about mono tenure now as sort of a collection of poor people, for want of a better description. So and local authority housing has largely become that. So the waiting list that the local authorities are nominating off, those people have very little opportunity. But actually, if we look at PRS and corporate investment into rented housing, no one's saying, is that a mono tenure, is that a bad thing? So I think it's not necessarily it's the tenure, it's really about mixed and balanced communities and creating place to live. And the sort of focus on ownership or the focus on rent, I don't think is necessarily the right place to go to.
No, it would be nice to think that the focus could be on things like, living in an area so that you have access to facilities like, being able to get to work, get your children to school, affordability, the ability to, once you've moved into a home, if it is social rented, that you might actually be able to move house, scaling up and scaling down. One of the things that I think is also an issue has been where, the bedroom tax was introduced to address this in some ways, to try and persuade people to move out when their children had moved out and they were under occupying social rented properties. Have you found that there's been a flow of properties that have come forward where people have been, have moved out and that's been another source at all?
No, people don't tend to move out very much. So there is some turnover in stock and residents, but it's relatively limited, and then that nomination goes straight to the local authority. So we give all of our nominations to local authorities. I think probably what we do see, and I'd be interested in other people's experiences, is an attraction of young people to market rented housing, and I think that gives people within that sort of cohort the opportunity to live within London and to build their family lives or their future lives, but there's no way they could afford to purchase. So I think there's still got to be some opportunity for to access housing, and that's generally got to be market related, I think, as well as the range of social rented homes, which is largely becoming family dominated. there's no real access for young single people into social rent.
So I'm going to ask Chris, if I may, whether, and then bring in others if you want to, given that we have this sort of ongoing issue with this massive imbalance between the supply, which is very small, and demand, which is very large, and very large waiting lists in places like Newham, as Josie was saying. Do you think there's an argument? I mean, I think there's an estimate. There's about 250,000 people now on waiting lists across the whole of London. And then since the introduction of the right to buy in 1983, we've probably lost 300,000 rented properties. Do you think there's now an argument for either raising the discount levels again, or meaning that you have to qualify over a longer period, or do you think we should just end the policy of right to buy in areas of housing stress altogether, just to maintain stock? Because the amount of new that's being produced by whatever route we're talking about, wouldn't that be another way of ensuring that we don't see further decline in availability of dwellings to rent at price points that people can afford?
Well, if you asked any councillor in any area of London, they would say end right to buy. Right, without they wouldn't even think about it, right? Because the erode, and the thing you have to look at is what the national picture is as well as the London picture. I mean, London is responsible for 2/3 of our national housing crisis in a sense, and about 70% of the spend. But nationally, we're building about 6,000 truly social homes a year. We're demolishing 5,000 and we're selling 24,000. So we're ending the year with 20,000 less every flipping year. And that's just not good enough. So yeah, if we were building more social homes, I mean, it's very interesting actually, because the counter argument, I'm going to do something very unusual here. I'm going to quote Policy Exchange, which is the right-wing think tank. And Boris Johnson was elected to government, or when he acquired power as Prime Minister. Policy Exchange was saying, it's time for Boris homes, not Boris buses, Boris homes. And they recommended that the Conservative government of Boris Johnson should build vast numbers of social homes and start a new programme of right to buy. Because they were like, well, why, because there is an analysis that this was an enormous transfer of wealth to lower income groups through right to buy, as people inherited and sold off into the rented sector, the council homes that have been bought by their parents. So there are both right and left wing arguments for building extremely large numbers of social homes and for only selling off social homes if you're building more.
Members and
that's
guests.
The context.
Members and guests, can I remind all of you that we spend a lot of our time in the Housing Committee debating the supply of building new homes, and we've very specifically scoped that out of this meeting to try to focus. Yeah. So I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. And hence my starting point. And right.
I know you're asking, Chris, don't worry. I know you're asking. I just think
David wanted to come in on the context.
He did want to come on the earlier question, I think. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just to, I mean, firstly, I am any councillor from any borough, and yes, end right to buy, but I won't dwell on that. But just on the earlier question about home sizes and kind of creating new homes from no homes, effectively, there is definitely more work to be done on that. In Islington, we have local lettings, which means that if we build new homes on your estate, you get first dibs on the new homes. That means that, for example, an older person, they want to stay on their estate, and the reason they don't want to part with their 2-bed, which they don't need them to do the 1-bed now, is because they want to stay in their community on their estate. But they will gladly move into a new 1-bed on their estate and then give up that 2-bed. And our local letting scheme has been challenged through judicial review, and the judges actually praised our local letting scheme for lubricating the entire system, getting everybody into the right size of home. I'm very proud to say our record so far is 8 homes from one locally let flat. So one person moves into a brand new flat, then 8 families through that process get into the right size of home. That's 8 homes that have been created from no homes. There's much more work to be done there.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It makes housing management much more complicated because you've got to do 8 lettings and do a lot of moves. But I think there's a huge amount that can be done through mutual exchange, local letting schemes, and all that kind of thing. I really do agree. Thank you, Chair.
Definitely worth the work.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Cooper. Right, members, we are a little behind. We've got until 4 for this meeting, though, and I know that some of the topics in the later questions have already slightly been covered. So I think we can move more fast through the next bits. But we've got an interesting section next on private investment, which Assemblymember Devonish is going to lead on. So you kick off, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'll try and stay on point. Although I love it when AM Cooper starts talking about the war. My kids tell me never to talk about the war. It makes me sound really old. Moving on anyway. If I can be really naughty and just ask one semi-construction question, because I'd be really interested in the views of the 3 or 4 experts on this line, and that is, do you think that air rights, i.e. building a couple of floors above some of your social housing, could in any way really help? And a really short answer, because I've been very naughty asking the question, would be good from Islington, LNG and Hounslow. Very quickly.
Yes, but it's not worth the hassle.
Islington?
Absolutely. We're actually doing it. I think in the future, the low-hanging fruit will be gone and most of our new build programme will be overbuilds. So absolutely, yeah.
And my favourite man, Ben Denton?
Thank you, sir. So it is hard work, but setting up specialist organisations that focus solely on that work can add capacity. It's about reproducibility again and again.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll move back to my question before I get told off by the chair. And as she says, we're moving on to social impact investment. And the question is, and we'll start with Ben, not simply because he's ex-Westminster Council, but because I know he always talks great sense like the rest of the committee. What role can private investment play in increasing social housing stock from existing homes? And I'm going to ask you all, when you try and answer these questions, again, try and give us some cumulative figures in terms of, like earlier question, how many extra 10, 100, 1,000 units do you think you could build a year by using these tools? Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, so we've got a couple of live conversations with local authorities in London at the moment, using long-term funding in partnership with local authorities. Each of those relationships are trying to deliver somewhere between 500 and 1,000 homes over a 5-year period, and they relate to specific localities. So those relationships generally end up being obviously buying homes within the borough where the relationship is existing. I think there is much more to do in that space. And in a way, it's using the models that, for example, Hounslow and Islington have already explained, but it's adding in institutional funding into that mix. And so that is a programme that can be run alongside a local authorities programme as well. So it's about how do you get multiple lines of activity to deliver growth. There are two. If I could just pick up again on something that Mr. Matthew raised, there are two aspects here. One is that there needs to be subsidy in the structure somewhere, and the second point is government, as this assembly knows, government and the GLA can create guarantee structures that reduce the cost of funding, and both of those you can either use them separately. But when you use both of them together, it can reduce down rents and therefore improve affordability. So the challenge is, though, guarantee structures work best at quite a significant scale. But you can't. It doesn't make sense to do a guarantee on a 50 million transaction. It makes more sense to do a guarantee on a 100 million or a 500 million transaction. So looking at these structures holistically can help to make a meaningful impact on transferring houses from the private, the private rented sector and ownership sector into the affordable sector.
Okay, and I'm going to be naughty now and ask you a very controversial question, Ben. You point out you need subsidy. I would argue that, bearing in mind the GLA and a lot of local authorities, I know Hounslow don't, but many other local authorities, including Islington and most of the central London ones, they are such large landowners. Surely, rather than always going to the government and saying more money, surely the GLA, as you know, owns land, TfL alone, the size of the London Borough of Camden. Other parts of the GLA own huge sites. Surely, people like you, along with the public sector, can actually come up with solutions that don't always need to go back to Michael Gove. We're too centralised in this country. I believe you can solve this with public sector bodies without having to go to Michael Gove's department.
Yes, I think so. That's a fair challenge. When I think about subsidy, I think of subsidy in a wide variety of ways. So, for example, you can absolutely have subsidy through discounted land. You can have subsidy through through taking affordable housing contributions and monetizing those and using that as subsidy to buy pre-loved homes rather than new homes. So it's thinking of subsidy in the broadest possible sense, as opposed to, and that subsidy can come locally, it can come out of land, it can come out of local government, and it can, but obviously that's through right to buy receipts, and it can come out of central government sometimes as well.
Well, I hope you're going to go and talk to our friends at the GLA who actually have the power to make that happen. What makes the social housing sector attractive to invest in for investors, please? And is there truly an appetite? Because we talk about this a lot. You know, is enough really happening, and what more can we do? I'll bring the other gentleman in a second.
Yeah, so I guess my reflection is probably 5 years ago, there wasn't really much. So institutions have always funded the affordable housing sector. So they take your hard-earned pension fund cash, it gets turned into debt, and then it gets lent to, it either gets lent to housing associations, or all those pension fund providers buy bonds from banks, and the banks then lend the money to housing associations. So institutions have always been involved in this marketplace. It's only really in the last 5 years that institutions have moved directly into the affordable housing market space. So I guess so the market is changing. There is a massive appetite to make sure that institutional funding delivers the maximum possible social and economic impact. So it's no longer acceptable for institutions to invest in polluting industries and things like that. So there is a massive focus. I think the reflection is the sector is still quite in its early stages. It is not a level. We joke that it's not a level playing field for an organisation like us to participate in the affordable housing sector. We have to pay uplift amounts. We pay residential property development tax, which the build to rent sector doesn't pay. We pay uplift amounts. We pay stamp duty, and then we pay corporation tax. So just by operating in this sector, we get taxed almost 5 times, and we're saying it would be helpful to have a bit more of a level playing field to be able to bring more funding in. I think my reflection is this: that there is a weight of interest in participating in this space. We just have to work really hard to show the benefit of what's possible on the ground by delivering schemes that are delivering net additional housing.
Thank you. And to Peter, Dermot, and then John, please. What are the risks for councils and housing associations when taking up private investments? Peter?
So I suspect the obvious is the uncertainty of future costs, because by and large, and Ben's really explained much of what I understand, so there is a certainty for the market in actually investing in social housing, and there is the certainty that actually as a good landlord you will always get a rental income. So the reverse is the case for local authorities. We are facing uncertainties in terms of actually future cost of capital, and therefore future repayment of leases, loans, and so on. So I think it is that general uncertainty. But I think the point I would make, which kind of picks up on Ben's points, I think there's a lot of scope for us to explore in the private sector space. But if you look at the current policy landscape, it facilitates two-way conversations. Yeah. So it enables conversations between local authorities and governmental bodies, or it might allow conversation between local authorities and the market. but there isn't a three-way conversation. And I think we need to think, how do we actually tie that circle? Because that's the key. Because even if I were to actually meet with Ben and say, let's do a deal, I still have to find the capital. Yeah. And the ability to subsidize is then removed because I'm speaking to Ben. And I think we've got to think through what is that three-way conversation.
Thank you. Dermot?
I think the fundamental risk is everyone on the same page on day one. I mean, a council house in Islington, a post-war council house, it's paid for itself several times over. It's been rented for 50 years or more. But that's a very, very long-term investment. And I think there is a basic problem in the market in London now, where it's about making back your investment very quickly. So that's a fundamental risk. Social housing is it's a sound investment, but it's a long-term project. So getting everyone on the same page day one is a massive risk there.
Thank you. And John?
So I'm pretty much in the same place as everyone else. I think it's consistency. We've heard that housing is a sort of global currency, but it's also way too political. So, over the past 10 years, we've had a social rent grant funded programme. Then we've had London Affordable Rent, no grant. Then we had a rent freeze for 4 years under Osborne. And then we had London Affordable Rent, no grant, some grant coming back in, down social rent. And for institutional investment, the institutions want to know there is a consistent business model there. They may accept a low return as long as they know what that return is going to be.
Thank you. And my final question, before I ask my final question to Ben, I just make a plea that the thing we love on the Housing Committee is written quality rather than quantity submissions. So, I do think after nearly 6 years of this mayor, most of the people, even the Labour members, will agree off the record, we're not building enough houses in London. You guys, actually, most of you on this call do the job. You're actually building properties and doing all these other clever things. So if you've got specific ideas and case studies, please send them through to Sian and the committee. We'd love to hear from you. So my final question is to Ben. What are the risks for investors compared with investing in new build construction, please?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. So from as a number of the guests have highlighted, in buying affordable housing, there is an absolute need to get beyond EPC C to get to B to A. So the challenge is it's not the buying of the housing, it's how to fund the retrofit and get to a position that works from a customer's, that works from a let's say a regulatory perspective, and we're a bit grey about what regulation looks like beyond EPCC in 2030. So I think our reflection is, the world will sort of land at somewhere between B and A as a required position, because they'll be decarbonising the grid that helps to balance the challenge. So that, if I was going to say, that is the one challenge where you're looking at bringing institutional funding in to hold affordable to hold affordable housing, because all of that institutional funding has a set of requirements set against it, which principally are driven by ESG requirements as well.
Thank you. I'll hand back to the chair because of time, but later on there's a question about what I would call reconfiguration of shopping centres and offices. I'd love to hear your views on that. It's not very clear in the question fully, but don't answer that question now. Chairman, back to you.
Yeah, we can answer that. We can ask that question to include that point. Thank you. Thank you, Assemblymember Demnish. I just wanted to ask a couple of bits of clarification from within this section. I know that earlier on, I think it was Ben again, commented on how most new build housing is for sale at the top decile, which I think is the top 10% of the homes that are changing hands in the local area, the sort of the market. How is that? I'm sorry, that might be a stupid question, but why would it be that these would be the very top of the market? Are there other factors? Is it marketing? Is it because like a new build development gets marketed and sold abroad, or what's going on there
it's because new things are worth generally. I mean, this isn't always the case. We do lots of analysis across lots of schemes, but generally new homes, if you think of a new home in a street, even if it was a terraced house in a Victorian street and someone had knocked that down and built a new house in that street, the new house will be worth more than the Victorian houses in that street. So it's just this constant challenge that if you had a certain amount of subsidy in the system, and sorry to keep talking about subsidy in the broader sense, how do you use that subsidy to maximise the number of people that can get off temporary accommodation and out of the housing list, waiting list, into affordable housing? So that's thinking holistically about how subsidy exists in the system.
So that's to do. There is a bit like marketing. That's to do with the desirability of a new home because it's new. It's the price of new, isn't it? Whereas I think, Josie, can I come back to you for a second? Because you earlier on gave us the numbers for the cost versus buying new of buying and bringing up to EPC, high EPC standards for a lot of the basic stock that we have across London, and you seem to think that's better value than buying the new stuff. Is that more or less right in terms of what you said earlier on, in terms of my interpretation?
So in terms of how we compete, so we compete at the lower end of the market, and that's why we're experimenting with common archetypes of property that already exist across the capital. The fact of the matter is that local authorities and other property owners are going to need to do work on those common archetypes of property. So it's a really important pilot for us to explore what that looks like and what the impact of it is and what the cost is. At the moment, our standard refurbishment cost is between £25,000 and £30,000 per property. That's what we spend as standard. There will be some properties that we buy where we spend a bit more than that, and some where we spend a bit less than that, but that's an average. So the pilot to bring a property to EPC A or A+ is over and above that.
Right, so that might work out. So that, again, we're back where we were talking about a moment ago, that
yes,
by the time you've brought it up to long-lived standards, you might be slightly less good value than buying new. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, great. That was all my clarifications. Moving on to further questions then, I believe we need to talk about, and it's me to start, we need to talk about empty homes a bit more. So we've talked about buying homes that are currently lived in from other tenures. But yes, so Chris, I know you gave us a really good summary at the beginning of what's going on there. So if you can clarify for us what you think the actual opportunities are. I think you said there were 30 to 40,000 longer term, sort of neglected longer term empty homes, as opposed to ones that are temporarily empty and going to come back into the market.
Yeah.
Do you think are some of them more like derelict, or do you think these all have the potential to be bought and brought back in? Is that?
No, they're not derelict. They would be in the wider category of council tax exempt, generally speaking. Because bizarrely, you don't need to pay if it becomes unlivable. You actually don't need to pay council tax on it, thereby removing one of the incentives to bring it back into use. Although there are other enforcement tools available, but they have to get stuck into those on a case-by-case basis, which is time-consuming. But to talk about volume, I think it is worth looking at what other cities have done with regulating their short-term lets markets. I mean, obviously there is going to be a role for short-term lets.
I'm really sorry, we're going to ask you about that later.
Okay, all right.
I've shut you up twice when you started talking about
no, it's okay.
short-term lets. But we will get to it.
Capacity and numbers, and you can look at financial return models.
Yeah, so your 30 to 40,000 excludes short-term lets.
It does exclude short-term lets, and it also excludes sort of transitional empties in the marketplace. Now, obviously, some of these will be being hung, and I think the other thing that's important to say is it excludes second homes. And if you talk to Kim over in Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea, who looks after housing there, council cabinet member, he would tell you that his big problem isn't the couple of thousand long-term empties; it's the 10,000 second homes which are effectively furnished empties that are just sitting around empty as investment property or as forms of saving. And he would really like to get some of those into use. To the extent that he wrote the housing minister when Kit Malthouse was
Breaking up a little.
2018, and said, look, we need to change. Oh, sorry, am I breaking up a bit?
You are, and I think it's just you. Is there anything you
do something about my internet access?
Do about that? Although you have moved on to second homes.
Well, because they're a form of empty. There's no difference. There's no third home. You can have as many as you like. They're just empty homes with a bit of furniture in them.
Yes, but I'm really. Thank you. We are.
You don't have to use them as a second home. This is the point that most people don't understand. Second homes don't mean second homes.
Yeah, so I'm trying to focus this meeting on things where there's a genuine opportunity to get them back, and I'm thinking we try and steal people's holiday homes.
Well, no legislation required. One piece of recommendation from the housing minister, and that changes.
Okay. In terms of the ones that are sitting long-term empty, though, the kinds of people we'd be buying off, who owns these? Because I think we've heard other contributors to the meeting talk about going to people who are trying to exit the buy-to-let market, people who've got empty homes, presumably are not buy-to-let landlords because they don't let their assets sit idle as much.
Well, they do in some markets, in low-value markets, but you're right, you don't see that so much in London. In low-value housing markets, actually, the bottom end of PRS does a high level of vacancy because people buy en masse at auction, and then it's not necessarily incentive to bring stuff into use quickly. But that's less common, relatively uncommon in the London market. But there will be a bit of that. But yeah, I mean, over 90% of them are privately owned, and some of the owners will come into the category of people who just simply don't have the wherewithal. They either don't know they own it, they don't understand the implications of owning it, they haven't got the money to bring it back into use, or they're sitting on it rather like a sort of accidental buy-to-leave investor because they inherited this house and they don't really want to spend money on bringing it into use. That it's not really costing them too much, and it's going up in value by a shocking amount every year. So why waste money bringing it back into use and putting tenants in it? You can just earn money by letting it sit around. I mean, so there is definitely an opportunity for a mixture of enforcement and incentives to bring some of those into use. And the leasing schemes like capital letters already do a bit of this, although the incentives are not anywhere near as high under that scheme as they are under some local authority dedicated schemes like Camden. So I mean, there would definitely be a role for a government programme, and in the absence of a government programme, a GLA-funded programme to bring some of these into use, possibly using community or social landlords as a mechanism for doing it would definitely have some effect.
Great, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Assemblymember Boff now for further questions on just a few more bits and pieces to do with empty homes, if that's all right. Andrew's having some trouble, I think, with his machine.
Oh, right, okay.
I was.
It's better.
I was, and now I'm not. I wanted to know whether or not there were any are there any areas of London where non-construction measures will be more viable due to, for example, higher numbers of empty properties or homes on the market? Perhaps that's to Chris and Chris Bailey and Toby Lloyd. Oh, Toby Lloyd.
We don't have Toby Lloyd.
We're Toby-less.
Oh, yeah. Perhaps to Chris then.
Okay. Well, I mean, some boroughs have more than others. Prices vary, of course. I mean, there are big chunks of empty housing in Southwark. There are big chunks of empty housing in Camden. There are big chunks of empty housing in Kensington and Chelsea. I mean, and they have different price tags attached to them, and they're different styles of empty housing. The numbers in Southwark have been rocketing up recently, and it does appear that some of that is stock that may previously have been in other markets, like short lets. It's difficult to say, but there is a lot of stock in Southwark that's empty. Of course, there will be some stock that's been emptied due to council-led regeneration schemes, so you have to be careful to fill that out of your calculations. But I mean, the thing about empty homes is they're not all one thing, and there are different types of empty homes in different places. But to reiterate what I said before, the majority of them are privately owned. They're not predominantly about local authority-led schemes. It's an interesting question. We have very low property transaction costs and property holding costs by international standards. One of the things we've looked at in the past is comparisons with other international markets where, vacancy tax, for example. Now, the mayor couldn't introduce a vacancy tax in a Vancouver style at the moment because it's not within the gifts of the devolution settlements. But those kind of across-the-board vacancy taxes that simply tax people for having a home and not.
Sorry,
I think we've lost Chris. Slightly fatally.
Use. In other words, they say, look, if you want this as a second home or investment, then you're going to pay a considerable percentage. So, and
have you made I mean, you're saying it's patchy and complex. If you wanted to focus on a particular part of London, there's a load of factors that need to take into consideration. Have you made an assessment of what proportion of empty homes could be immediately occupied and what proportion would require significant refurbishment?
Hopefully, I don't know what my internet connection's like at the moment. Hopefully it's okay. Are you hearing me okay?
It's patchy, to be honest.
I've switched connection. Okay, so thank you for letting me know. And if you can't hear me, please ask me to repeat things because I've switched networks in the hope of making it more stable. To be honest, the majority of the homes that are officially classed as long-term empty could be brought into use pretty quickly, actually. And when there have been programs in the past that have done this, there have been average conversion costs to bring them up to decent standards of around £20,000 a home, and you might want to increase that a little bit to take out of inflation. Now there's a lot of inflation in building materials and labour, but and you might want to spend a bit more if you want to bring it up to top EPC levels. But I've looked at data across a really wide range of conversion types, and most of this stuff could be into pretty quickly without particularly significant cost. The stuff that's high cost isn't in those numbers.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. Every time we invest in making an empty property available for social rent, aren't we actually taking away money from investing in new build?
Well, that's a very interesting argument, but the amount of money you're taking, that's only if you think building new builds for the sake of it is a virtue, and that's a heated debate, which I could bring some economists to bear on.
Right.
I mean, building is people in the house building sector will tell you what the multiples from house building are in terms of employment and everything else, but you get some of those multiples as well. But the reality is, if you want to increase social housing stock, you're going to need to convert, you're going to need to buy, you're going to need to build. It's just making good use of stock. And we also have a huge retrofit challenge in terms of bringing stock into use. And programs that do that and do it for public good seem to me to be beneficial.
Thanks. I'm going to hand back to the chair now. Thank you for those replies.
Thank you.
I hope that came across all right. I mean, sorry about it.
It was a struggle, to be honest, but I think we got the meaning.
I think we did. Yeah, we missed a couple of bits, but we can always write back to you if we feel like, well, we've got it transcribed. There's a transcription made of this meeting, and we might need to come back to you for a couple of clarifications. Okay. But I'm going to pass over now to Assembly Member Baker for a few more questions on issues around empty homes, I think. And
thank you, Chair. And we will get on to short-term lets as well. But just one further question on empty homes, both to Bruce Bailey. Also, Peter and Dermot, be interested in your take from the local authority as well. So we've spoken a little bit about some of the powers that the mayor and the local authorities do have, but what further powers might be needed, and is there a need for primary legislation? You've mentioned a vacancy tax, Chris. I don't know whether there's further things that you think the government could introduce to bringing empty homes back into use.
Okay, well, sorry, go on.
Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
You sure? Okay. I mean, the first thing I'd say is you said that things that the government could introduce, and the government clearly could introduce a new national empty homes programme which helped councils provide funding to people to bring empty homes back into use, whether they were people in the social sector, the community sector, or the private sector. And that would be a good thing. So it worked last time. It did bring extra stock in. It was a limited programme last time. It brought about 20,000 homes in, not just in London. It's a proven piece of public policy. It would work, yes. Beyond that, you would have to look at regulating returns from non-residential uses of property. And I don't know whether I think I was instructed by the chair to talk about that later, wasn't I, about the regulation of Airbnb and what impact that could have.
Any minute now, I'll ask you that in a second.
Okay.
Dermot, will you try and get it?
Yes. So if we look at this from a kind of a carrot and stick perspective, I think we, certainly in Islington, we work with a lot of accidental landlords, and we've got a really great housing needs team who's very, very good at working with accidental landlords to get and putting them in touch with homeless households and getting those homes back into use. And I have to say that I feel that we've kind of exhausted that side of it now. I think we're doing everything we can. There is definitely a need for more enforcement and more primary legislation on enforcement. And I'll just a case in point in this is in terms of punitive measures. I mean, you can roughly double the council tax on an empty home, but that's pretty much all you can do. The classic case is the Ministry of Justice's 28 empty 3 and 4 bedroom homes at Wellington News in Islington. I actually did discuss this point with the civil servant and said, look, you're paying double council tax on all these homes, let us work with you to get them back into use. And his reply was, well, in terms of overall budget, really, paying double council tax isn't that much. So it really wasn't any kind of a good, effective enforcement at all. We need punitive taxes on empty properties, and that requires primary legislation.
Thanks, Dermot. Peter, did you want to?
Yeah, so my answer is probably more direct and blunt. What would actually cause me to get my staff who are hard pressed to spend time to actually get an empty home into use, given that it takes a ferocious amount of work, ineffective regulations that we're working with, and no money. So why would I do it? No, I won't. So if you really want me to do this, I probably want a new piece of primary legislation. There used to be, I think there still is, it used to be, it's still called PROD, P-R-O-D, Public Right to Order Disposal. We need a private right to order disposal, so that when we see lots of private properties sitting empty, we have a simple piece of legislation that we can use to either order the disposal of that property or order its bringing back into use. So we need simple legislation that we can use. And I think the second thing then is actually then there is a cost to the local authority, so there has to be some funding for it. Now, I think I'm only really talking in regards to private property. I don't think we should be talking about legislation for local authorities to bring back empty local authority properties back into use. We should be doing that anyway.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And on short-term lets, finally, Chris, so what role and what level do you think there is for repurposing homes currently let as short-term lets as social housing? And also, you did really briefly touch upon this. Are there international examples of bringing short-term lets back into long-term use that we can learn from in London?
Yeah, thanks. All short-term lets won't be automatically things you could bring in easily into social housing use, but quite a lot will be. And we did see during the pandemic councils like Camden being offered stuff which had previously been in the short let market, and their first observation was they were getting much better quality stuff for their TA than usual, and their second observation was that not quite all of it worked because some of it had been subdivided into tiny units for use on a short-term basis. But over and above all that, yeah, if you look at Berlin, when Berlin introduced regulation, they did bring a significant number of properties back into use. I've probably got a number on that somewhere.
Please do forward numbers to us afterwards.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, you don't need to have more stats quoted at you, but it brought about 20% of the lets immediately back into the long-term market when Berlin introduced regulation. And there are lots of different approaches to regulation. I think what works best is overall regulation with the opportunity for local authorities to set limits, and to license effectively. As Tony commented, we are too centralised in this country, so let's have regulation done locally by local government. What we do need, however, is information sharing between Airbnb and local government to allow proper regulation, and that could be done through agreement now. Amsterdam was the first city to agree regulation with Airbnb, and they imposed a limit of 30 days. We have 90 days. One of the things that's very interesting is to look at average Airbnb returns, then to times it by 90 days, and you'll see why most Airbnbs break the limit. Because actually, if you want an effective investment return from a piece of property in London, then you're probably going to be breaking the Airbnb regulatory limit, and there are lots of ways around it. And we need to stop that happening. We need to stop that open door. We need proper regulation. And when that proper regulation takes place, you will automatically see stuff flow back into the long-term market, because the reality is that if based on average returns, most of those people are making a lot more than 13.5 grand a year out of their Airbnbs. And they would make a hell of a lot more by renting it long-term as well, in many cases. So, the reality is there is a market solution to this, but it just needs sensible regulation, and we need to stop pretending we have that when we don't.
Thanks. And just specifically on social housing, are there any mechanisms that you're aware of that would sort of shortcut the short-term let straight into social housing? I know you're mostly bringing them back sort of generally onto the market. Is there anything specific?
Well, I mean, ultimately, you'd have to buy or lease. I mean, you could have enforced leasing solutions, where if people break the limit, they get put into an enforced leasing scheme. Or if they have long-term vacants, could be put into a leasing scheme.
Yeah.
So so that's ultimately what you're going to have. It is going to depend on regulation. It is going to depend in some cases on legal changes. So you can absolutely do it, and there are examples of it being done. I would say that some of the examples in places like Barcelona are a little bit symbolic, where the mayor has taken properties off, empty properties off banks and institutions and large landlords and moved them into the social sector. But it's every extra social home in Barcelona, rather like in London, is a valuable thing.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd quite like to extend the meeting by 15 minutes to finish off a few further questions, particularly about conversions. Are there any guests who might need to leave sooner than that if we finish at 4:15? Thank you. If you can all stay, that'd be amazing. Now, I can see that Assemblymember Devonish has his golden hand up. Would you like to come in on the end of that last section? And then
15 seconds now, Chair, and it will be literally 15 seconds.
Go for it then.
As Dermot has very cleverly plugged his emoji.
Chris, can you mute, please, because you've got background noise.
Oh, apologies.
Sorry, Tony, carry on.
As the Islington Cabinet member has twice plugged his MOJ project, I'd be very happy with you, Chair, to write a letter to Dominic Rabb, who I know, if he gives us the information to try and unlock it. I can't promise anything, but I'm always happy and I'm always impressed when a fellow councillor tries to get something off the government for his own community. So I'd happily do that if he wants to send through the details to the committee.
I'd be happy to second that.
Yes, it's in your constituency, is it not? Yeah, that's a very generous offer. Thank you. And this is, I think, as Dermot has said a couple of times, it's a bit of a classic case. So let's see if we can crack it. Yeah. Right. Moving on to the next section. Assemblymember Mohammed, it is actually your question next. So I'll let you take it.
So my question is very brief. You'll be pleased to know, and it's to John and Josie. Just from your perspective, what's the possibility of permitted development right conversions being suitable for social housing? So should we start with John?
I don't think they're suitable. So we haven't done any permitted development, and we don't intend to. We don't think it's suitable for either social housing or for market housing.
Short but sweet. Okay, great. Thank you. Josie?
I think my view is probably slightly more nuanced than that. I think it might depend on the particular permitted development, but I think the potential pitfalls are about the location of properties that are being considered for permitted development and whether they're suitable as housing developments. There are some examples, or certainly an example I'm aware of outside of London that is quite clearly in an unsuitable location for housing for lots of reasons. And there's also a potential issue around space standards and how that is factored in, because to make the numbers work, what's happened in places where this has already been done is that properties have been converted into some very small units. Rabbit hutches, I think, is the term that's often used, which is a very unfortunate mental picture. So I'm not saying it's never okay, but it probably depends on where it is, what the property is like, and what the plan is. So I think that I think that care needs to be taken in giving consent to allow permitted developments to happen for housing.
Okay, thank you. And if we come to Dermot and Ben, I feel like you're just particularly interested in your archway experience. It'd be really helpful to share.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's definitely one the committee should have a look at, because in Islington we have the opposite problem. PD is stopping social rent houses from being built or being converted. And we've got two examples actually right beside each other, both near Archway Tube Station. Archway Tower, as it used to be called, now it's got some silly name like High Point or something. Anyway, it was called, we always call it Archway Tower, and Whittington House, which is just next to it. The Whittington House was a fully occupied office building. Archway Tower was partially occupied, but there's now over 150 flats in those buildings, and the PD has just allowed those developers to bypass our planning system. So obviously in Islington we've got one of the toughest planning policies in the country. Every new development has to be 50% genuinely affordable, and we're quite clear what we mean by genuinely affordable: 35% social rent and 15% intermediate. PD has meant that those buildings have been converted without a single genuinely affordable home. So I have to say, I'm afraid PD's had the opposite effect.
Okay, thank you. And Ben.
And I think so. We have delivered some PD schemes and then used grants to convert the housing to affordable. And I'd just echo Josie's point, is that you just need to be very careful thinking about the building, the location, and it's going to pass the you or I test, which is, would that be a home that you or I would be proud to live in for a long term?
Okay, so I guess I'd be really interested for us to think about some of the opportunities forgone by following the PD route. Those you don't get SIL, you don't get Section 106, all those sorts of things, that local investment. And for social value, the apprenticeships in the area. I just wonder, Peter, you raised earlier a point about upfront costs. So obviously there are, in a normal development that goes through planning, you have that at the end of the process. If there is a perspective, perhaps, just reflection on that. I think you had talked about what you don't get through the non-development routes.
So are we still talking about PDRs?
Yeah, just in relation. You might not necessarily, but have a view. But
we haven't had much of a problem with PDRs, probably because we're pretty hostile to them, if I'm really honest. And in many ways, I think PDRs, to me, it's one of these devices which is a race to the bottom of quality and everything. I think we need to be very careful about it. And by definition, it means all of the things you just mentioned, they're no longer in frame, because we cannot negotiate them, we cannot discuss them. We don't have the mechanisms to engage in that type of conversation. So it's very difficult to actually see the benefits of PDRs in our community in that way. I think a revised PDR, which is not simply saying you have the right to convert your offices directly to offices, but actually allows some degree of control, some degree of negotiations with the local authority, may work. But I think the way it's currently structured, I don't see how local authorities could support it.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting. We've framed all those questions around permitted development, and I think Assemblymember Devonish was before urging us to ask a little bit. I don't know. Are there no opportunities for converting existing buildings into good quality social homes? I think is basically the question. Is that right, Assemblymember Devonish?
I mean, the people from the industry, Chair, will know very well that all the really clever developers at the moment are looking at what they call buying a shopping centre, cutting it in half, keeping half of it as a shopping centre, and then turning the other half into a combination between market housing, PRS, a bit of affordable housing, and a bit of office, and also looking at some of the really old, tired, Ben made this point in terms of resi, but in terms of the cost of actually changing all the offices from the appalling standards many of them are in terms of energy and sustainability to things that are going to be allowed not to be knocked down in the next 10 years. A lot of the really clever guys in the industry are looking at that at the moment and buying stuff with pensions funds, etc. And some of those assets are actually owned by local authorities directly, or at least part of the site is owned by local authorities. I know these are always very complicated jobs and it takes a huge amount of activity, but surely brilliant people like Islington and Hounslow and LNG could be looking at, particularly LNG with all their money, could be looking at this.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions to go, but I noticed Assemblymember Wormer's put a hand up again, and I think maybe we can clarify our questions and then just open out to the people who've put their hands up. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, so this was more just, I suppose, accidentally a comment on what Assemblymember Devonish has said. I mean, it just strikes me that this conversation, we framed it and we struggle to frame it about non-construction methods of additional social housing. What seems to me a relatively simple kind of summary of this conversation is that the idea that more social housing is needed is not contested. The construction route is whether or not that's cheaper or more efficient. What we are not doing is creating more housing in the capital, but there perhaps is, I will relent this time, a little bit of a grain of truth in what Assemblymember Devonish has said. However, this one time. However, all of these different factors that people are looking at, we are looking at ways to circumvent, as Dermot Ward said, a broken market. We are trying to find ways to bring stuff from the private rented sector back into social. Surely there is something that the committee could look at, which is to look at what is the problem in the private rented sector as well, or are there more robust mechanisms that the Assembly or the government or both or local councils or three need that we could look at in our recommendation? Because what we're looking at is that I think the reason that we struggled with framing the question is because we sort of know the answer already. It is more social housing. It's bringing it back, taking it back from the right to buy sector, bringing it back into public ownership, or having that funding from LNG and others to build that housing for a long-term hold so that it's rented at a stable rent for the next 20, 30 years. So my little rant over.
Okay, that's helpful as a summary of the entire meeting. I think in terms of the conversions, I think I took from what Assemblymember Devonish was saying just then that these were more like construction projects where you get rid of half the shopping centre, not convert it into homes. Is that? But I think there is a grey area somewhere in between construction and conversion, I guess.
Or it's refurbishment, Chair. You can't just there is construction involved. You can't just turn it, like a magic wand, unfortunately.
Okay, exactly. Right, so we can refurbishment can be more expensive as well than new build, as the experts will tell you. But it's something we should be looking at anyway. Let's open this up to our guests now that we've clarified what we're thinking about. So in the order of hands that came up, I think we're looking at Dermot from Islington first. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, isn't the basic thing about PD that it was about circumventing the planning system? And the planning system, whatever you think about it, is a way to address market failures, a way to create genuinely affordable homes. That's why, you know, local authorities have policies for genuinely affordable homes. So, like Peter said, you know, if the government are very keen on PD, then why don't they allow permitted development, but make it subject to genuinely affordable housing policies? That would mean that when you do it in Islington, you can convert them, but you've got to convert it to 50% genuinely affordable. Job done.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. Peter from Hounslow, you want to?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. So I agree with exactly what's just been said, but to answer the point also about shopping centres, etc., we're having wonderful conversations with our shopping centre owners, etc., about what they might be able to do and not do. And a big part of that is actually how might they bring in housing. But it goes back to that earlier point that we've got to think about what is the three-way conversation between local authorities, private sector, and actually government. Because that seems to be where much of the conversation stalls, that local authorities would wish to go into partnership to deliver social housing as part of those schemes, but we still need the access to the subsidies, which are not forthcoming.
Okay, John next. John Hughes.
I think there seems to be a bit of overlap between PD and redevelopment. PD is just creating a windfall for the individual developer with no added benefit to the wider community, either through affordable housing or through wider community benefits. So it seems to me that housing has to be regulated. We have to have good quality homes for people, and PD doesn't provide that, and that's why I wouldn't support PD. But absolutely, we should be trying to reuse our built environment where we can. We should be using that to provide wider benefits to the community, both housing and leisure and retail, and to recreate those town centres into something that's meaningful both for now and for the future. So if we can reuse those resources, let's do that, but let's do it under a regulated structure.
Okay, thank you. And Ben.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I guess the redesignation of shopping centres is a form of redevelopment of air rights as well. So the ability to create. Back to this point about if you can build within air rights, then you're creating subsidy that can then allow you to build more affordable housing. So I think that's a point. I think the other thing, just a step wider, is there is a significant sale of buy-to-let homes at the moment. So what's happened through the policy of not being allowed to claim all of your interest charges as a buy-to-let property, what has happened as a result is there is a net loss of buy-to-let properties coming into the marketplace, and so that is an opportunity of flow to be able to capture that and deliver more conversions than maybe might otherwise be the case. The counter to that is obviously as more buy-to-let properties exit the marketplace, there are less properties to let, so rents go up, which makes renting less affordable and therefore, you know, creates an even greater need for more rented affordable housing.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. I have Assemblymember Moema has her hand up to make an extra point, and then can you hand directly on to Assemblymember Baker for the very final question?
Of course, yeah. I just wanted to that was a very interesting point, Ben. I suppose from my perspective, and hopefully other members of the committee, the sale of that buy-to-let property means that those private tenants that were in there are immediately homeless, and they end up on Peter and Dermot's waiting lists potentially. It doesn't actually resolve a housing crisis, but I take the point that there's more stock available, but there's also more people now homeless. So I'll hand that back over. I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Yeah, so Assemblymember Baker with our very final question on one particular final issue.
That's yeah. Thanks, Chair. So this is to John Hughes, and it's specifically about current shared ownership properties and whether there's an appetite among housing associations to switch shared ownership to social housing, and is it feasible to do so? And is there a significant cost to doing so?
Yes, it's absolutely feasible to do so, and we'd love to do so, but we need more grant to do that. And so, yeah, the grant, the differences in grant is about 100,000 for a social rented property.
That's a nice snappy answer to the last question, I think, Chair. Back to you. Thanks, Chair.
Excellent, thank you very much. And yes, we heard earlier, I think, I'm trying to think who it was because I've made lots of notes. We've heard that some of the people are, I think with the Right to Buy Back Fund possibly, are buying up homes that were shared ownership in bulk. Was that you, Peter, saying that earlier on?
Yes.
So there is scope for some other ways to get shared ownership homes into the social sector, which is really useful.
Yeah, but in a sense, what we were doing was actually converting it from shared ownership into social.
So effectively providing the grant that was just mentioned.
Well, exactly. In a sense, what we found was actually that some of the housing associations were sitting on large volumes of shared ownership. And so we bought them and we were able to then convert it straight into the HRA as social rent.
Yeah, it's really interesting that's feasible. That's really helpful to know. Okay, great. I need to wrap up the meeting. I'm sorry that it went on longer than we expected. I wasn't expecting to have so much to discuss, and I think it's really interesting that all of you came along and are all full of ideas and things that you're doing and things that also that I think you've started doing in the last few years. That's really interesting. So thank you very much to all our guests. The committee has a few more final items of just business to sign off on the agenda. You're all free to leave the call if you wish now, my guests, but if members can stay on, that'd be great. Members, can we note the report that we had today and today's discussion, please?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we also, at item 8 on the committee agenda, note our work programme for the future?
Noted.
Item 9 is the date of the next meeting, and we're having a formal committee meeting on the 22nd of March at 10 o'clock.
Oh, where's that going to be then, Sean?
I was going to say, hopefully in New City Hall. We will see.
No, I don't think so. I don't think we're doing meetings there. I think we'll be back in Onion Street, won't we?
We may be. We'll definitely be in a physical location, though, for a formal meeting.
You sure?
Can we go to the pub?
We have to be. We literally have to be. So we'll convene somewhere.
Okay, just checking.
And then item 10, any other business. I don't have any other urgent business, so I can thank members for all their really interesting questions and contributions and declare the meeting closed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sean, can you just pass on? That was really, really fascinating.